In the last lecture module, we looked at the third and final real-world case that Rachel presents in this chapter. In this module, we want to shift our focus again and look at the principles or lessons that Rachel thinks that we should learn from the examination of these cases. Now, the first lesson he thinks we should learn is that moral judgments must follow from reasons. And he gives us a couple of reasons why we ought to believe that. First of all, he notes that moral cases can be complex. They can be nuanced, difficult to understand. Sometimes it may be difficult to get a hold of all the facts. But, he thinks, objective facts matter. Whether someone is likely to live or will not survive something may be an important objective fact. And by an objective fact, I mean an intersubjective fact, a fact that everyone should acknowledge because it is part of the case. Rachel notes that initial judgments often differ, and he blames this to some degree on emotional reactions. He doesn't think that emotional reactions are necessarily bad per se, but he does think that we can be biased by our emotional reactions, that they can come from what you might consider to be irrational or less rational sources. So a lot of times, if we examine our beliefs about morality, about justice, about our place in society, we'll notice that a lot of our beliefs are the beliefs that we sort of got through osmosis by being a member of the particular community that we have. And so we may or may not have good reasons for believing them, but we oftentimes feel very strongly about them. We have emotional commitments to them. And so Rachel says oftentimes when people confront a moral situation, they'll make a judgment, and that judgment can often be determined by these other features, our culture, our history, our emotional reaction to something. And he says in order for us to be able to act morally, we have to evaluate those judgments in light of the objective facts of the matter as best that we can determine them. And so he thinks that correct judgments are discovered. They're not merely felt, and they're not merely reactive. People come to a moral conclusion because they reason carefully about the details and the facts. The second principle that Rachel thinks our reflection on these cases brings to light. Moral judgments are normative claims. They're supposed to regulate not just our behavior, but everyone's behavior. And because they're normative claims, and because they're supposed to apply to everyone equally, he wants us to think of normative claims as being principled and comprehensive. And he emphasizes this idea that when we make moral evaluations in the real world, we'll oftentimes come up with a principle, and we'll use that principle combined with the objective facts of the matter to try and derive a consequence, not just for us in particular, but in general. And for that reason, he thinks that our normative claims here, if they're going to be able to regulate not just our behavior, but everybody's behavior, they have to require consensus. So we have to evaluate our principles and how they work, not just whether they work for us, but whether they work in general. And in particular, he wants to emphasize that this kind of consensus requires impartial consideration of everyone's interests equally. That is, when we're reasoning morally, we're applying principles that we evaluate and determine are in fact principles that people should accept on the basis of the fact that they do not discriminate, they are not arbitrary, they treat all affected parties with respect and equally. Let's finish this lecture module by looking at Rachel's minimum conception of morality and his notion of a rational ethical agent. So Rachel tells us in that section on the minimum conception of morality on page 13 that morality is, at the very least, the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. That is, to do what there are the best reasons for doing while giving equal weight to the interests of each individual affected by one's decision. In line with that, he tells us that the conscientious moral agent then is going to look as follows. The conscientious moral agent is someone who is concerned impartially with the interests of everyone affected by what he or she does. who carefully sifts through facts and examines their implications, who accepts principles of conduct only after scrutinizing them to make sure they are justified, who is willing to, in quotes, listen to reason, even when it means revising prior convictions, and who, finally, is willing to act on the results of this deliberation. So this is the conception of morality and moral agency that Rachel's has built up to in this chapter. In the next lecture module, I want to talk a little bit more generally about normative codes of behavior and their relationship to each other, and to also talk a little bit about my suggestions for how to get the most out of this class.